All right, hi everyone, this is Mr. Lorenc. Today our lesson is going to focus on part 3 of our upcoming assessment, our review exam. So you've already completed part 1, which is the multiple choice. You've completed part 2, the thematic essay. And today we're going to start working on part 3, your DBQ, your document-based question essay. So today we're not in class together, so we're going to use our tools in order to get the same support as if you were in class. So the plan is today we'll look at historical context, we'll look at our task to get you ready for the essay. I'm going to read through the documents, go over a few things with your questions so you have the opportunity to do this at home. Don't forget, utilize the opportunity of the video to pause, to go back, to rewind, to listen to it again if you have any questions or concerns. All right, so let's start off. In front of you, you should have your DBQ essay, your task, which looks like this. You should have it in front of you, ready to go. Also, make sure you have a writing utensil, pen or pencil. Also, of course, have our highlighter to make sure you can actually work with your documents. So, if you could just follow along, I'm going to start off by reading us the historical context of what is the background of the essay you're going to be writing and some of the document research you're going to do. So it says, throughout the United States history, during times of crisis and change, presidents have communicated their ideas to the American people to influence public opinion and to gain their support. These written addresses and speeches have had significant impact on United States and American history. 3 of such addresses are George Washington's farewell address, which we've talked a lot about, from 1796, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which we reviewed from 1863, and Franklin D. Roosevelt's first inaugural address from 1933. So if you scroll down on your sheet, you're going to see your task. It says, using the information from your documents and the knowledge of U.S. history, you'll answer the questions below from document in Part A, and you'll answer the questions will help you write your essay, which is in Part B. So your job today is to select 2 of the following addresses, either George Washington, Lincoln, or Franklin Roosevelt, and do for each the following. You'll describe the historical circumstance surrounding the address. You'll explain a major idea in the address, and you'll discuss the impact of the address, the United States and or American society. So again, feel free to pause, rewind if you need to go back to review what your task is going to be. So again, today my goal is to read through the documents with you so you have that support that we would normally have during a test in school. You'll have it at home. So we're going to start off with Part A, your short answers, with document 1. Now, a good test-taking strategy for this to prepare you for your exam is before you even get into the document, make sure you take your time and you actually read the questions first. So I'm always going to read the questions first so we know what we're looking for. Then, using our trusty highlighter, you're going to interact with the actual document itself. You're going to highlight what you think are the correct answers to support your final decision on those document questions. So let's look at document number 1. So document number 1, the first questions ask, according to John Ferling, state 2 accomplishments George Washington achieved during his administration. That's what we're looking at to identify 2 within this document. All right, so here we go. Let's go through document 1 together. So please follow along. Make sure you have your highlighter. You're prepared to look for 2 ideas that helped Washington to achieve his goal. So starting off, document 1, it reads, but there was something else to Washington's thinking about retirement. He had achieved everything that he had set out to accomplish. Indeed, no other president has been more successful. With him to rally around, the Union had survived 8 years of incredible stress and strain. The economic torments that he had persisted for nearly 15 years in war and peace had been vanquished. As never before, American manufacturing faced a promising future, offering hope to the new nation would shortly overcome its dependence on foreign goods and be capable of equipping itself in a time of war. Worries that the West might break away had been laid to rest. Peace with European powers had prevailed and had throughout Washington's presidency. In truth, he said in his final State of the Union address, the survival of the new national government, an open question on the outset of his presidency, had been positively resolved. Most Americans believe the United States would endure. All right, so for this first document, I want to do this with you. So question again asks, according to John Ferling, state 2 accomplishments George Washington achieved during his administration. So when I reviewed my document, I highlighted the central part that talked about the importance of American manufacturing, importance of the West being part of the United States and not separating from the new government, and finally, the peace that existed between European powers. So my first answer would be growth of the American manufacturing supply itself during war. Could be one answer. You could also have the integrated Western frontiers as part of the new government. And finally, you can also use peace with European powers. So that should give you a good model for document 1. So let's continue through the rest of the documents to help you prepare for your essay. So I'll continue the same process. I'll read the question, then we'll read the document, and finally read the question one more time, moving on. So please, again, don't forget, use the great technology we have at our fingertips. Pause, rewind, go back if you have any questions or concerns. So document number 2 is the following. So the question asks, based on the document, what is President George Washington's advice about the conduct of the United States foreign policy? So the document 2A reads, the great rule of conduct for us in regard of foreign nation is in extending our commercial relationships to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagement, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here let us stop. Europe has set a primary interest which to us have none or a very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties to the ordinary shifts of her politics or the ordinary combinations and collusions of her friendships and enemies. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course. If we remain one people under efficient government, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyance. When we may take such an attitude as will cause the neutrality we may at any time resolve upon are scrupulously respected. When belligerent nations, under the impossibility of making acquisitions upon us, will not lightly hazard in giving the provocation, when we may choose peace or war or interest guided by justice shall counsel. So guys, one other reminder as we're going through these documents, please not only highlight your answers, but highlight any terms or phrases. There's a lot of words we're using here which you might not feel comfortable with. You can look up, you can define right here using the technology, or you can bring them back to class and we can go over and review them as well. So again, the question asks, based on the document, what is President George Washington's advice about the conduct of the United States foreign policy? All right. Moving on to document 2. Document 2 question asks, 2B's question asks, based on the document, what policy does President Woodrow Wilson recommend the United States follow in response to war breaking out in Europe in 1914? So it starts off, I venture therefore, my fellow countrymen, to speak a solemn word of warning to you against the deepest, most subtle, most essential break of neutrality which may spring out of partisanship, out of passionately taking sides. The United States must be neutral in the fact as well as in the name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action. We must curb upon the sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be constructed as a preference of one party to struggle before another. So again, the question asks, based on this document, what policy does President Woodrow Wilson recommend that the United States follow in response to war breaking out in Europe in 1914? All right, moving on to 3A. We have a political cartoon. So it looks something like this. I'll review the questions in a second, but just want to give you an idea where we should be for 3A. So we have a document for 3A and 3B, but the question asks, based on these documents, why did it become more difficult for the United States to follow President George Washington's foreign policy advice in the 20th century? So document 3A title says, European War Narrows the Atlantic. On the left, you have Uncle Sam. It says, it ain't what it used to be. And on the right, we see Europe, and dividing us is the Atlantic Ocean. So again, if there's any answers from this document you choose to answer question 3, please highlight so you can identify that. Now, document 3B below, it reads, isolationism, likewise, has gone the way of the horse and buggy. The policy of not entangling alliances has been spectacularly reversed in response to outside dangers, to the point where the United States is involved in more than 40 tangling alliances. Non-intervention has become wholesale intervention, whether in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, or the Cold War. The United States is no longer content to drift to the mercy of events. It is determined to use the enormous power to control those events in the interest of its own peace and security. Non-involvement has become involvement in the affairs of several score of nations, whether through economic or military programs. The United States cannot leave the world alone because the world will not leave it alone. So again, question 3 asks, based on the documents, why did it become more difficult for the United States to follow President George Washington's foreign policy advice in the 20th century? All right, moving on. Document 4A and 4B also have a question with 4. So just so you can see, again, 4A is an actual graph, so please make sure you highlight within it if you use any information to support your answer for question 4. So question 4 asks, based on the documents, why is it important for President Abraham Lincoln to speak to the nation after the Battle of Gettysburg? So looking at 4A, again, you do have a chart. It's entitled Civil War Battle Casualties, and as we move through, it identifies major battles. From 1863, we have Vicksburg, the Second Bull Run Battle of 1862, Stones River, 1862 through 63, Chancellorsville, 1863, the Wilderness, 1864, Spotsylvania, 1864, Chickamauga, 1863, and finally Gettysburg in 1863. So you have a comparison of casualties in Chart A, or 4A. In document 4B, it reads, the country needed some sort of ceremony at Gettysburg. The shock of this battle had gone into the bones and sinews of people all the way from Minnesota to Maine. Thousands of men had died, thousands more had been maimed, and many other thousands had been through 3 days of the most agonizing experience. After the battle, the armies had gone down into Virginia, and all through the summer and the fall, they had been moving back and forth, colliding now and then, striking sparks with skirmishes of cavalry infantry outposts, fighting small battles, moving and shooting, wasting men. The war seemed to be going on, and nobody could see an end to it. It was clear enough that in some mysterious way the fight at Gettysburg had symbolized everything that the nation was trying to do, everything for which it had given its sons, for which homes in every city and town, country hamlet, had known the grief of loss and final separation, and to dedicate this cemetery in Pennsylvania was somehow to pay tribute to the young men who had been killed and the families that had lost them. So again, question 4 asks, using document 4A and 4B, answer the following. Based on these documents, why was it important for President Abraham Lincoln to speak to the nation after the Battle of Gettysburg? All right, document 5 has one document with one question. I'll read the question. According to President Abraham Lincoln, what is the greatest task that remains for the living? So document 5, which is the Gettysburg Address. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated in the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether the nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of this war. We have come to dedicate a portion of this field as a final resting place for those here who gave their lives and the nation might live, so the nation may live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggle here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave that last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So guess question 5 for document 5 asks, according to President Abraham Lincoln, what is the great task that remains for the living? Moving on to document number 6 and question number 6. Question 6 asks, according to Merrill D. Peterson, how did President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address of 1863 continue to influence the United States in the 20th century? So it says, Martin Luther King Jr. was a keynote speaker at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. So from that speech. For the other speakers, the Lincoln Memorial seemed nothing more than a stage setting, but King began by acknowledging the hero of the Pantheon, or the memorial behind him. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of hope to millions of slaves who had been scarred in the flame and withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak, the end of a long night of their captivity. Sadly, 100 years after this, we are still not free. The oration became King's own second Emancipation Proclamation. It rose to a crescendo of the I have a dream. I have a dream that one day that the nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Thus did King like the Lincoln like Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address, dedicate the country to a new birth of freedom in the pursuit of an old dream. This speech Martin Luther King Jr. gave, more than any other single event, it has been said, legitimized the ongoing African-American Revolution in the eyes of most Americans and came to symbolize the historic national turning point, lifting King into the pantheon of great American heroes. So again, question 6 asks, according to Merrill D. Peterson, how did President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in 1863 continue to influence the United States in the 20th century? All right, moving on to documents 7A and 7B are both visual documents. They should look something like this that you have within your packet. So we also have document 7C, which is another political cartoon. So you have 3 documents that go with one question for number 7. So I'll read question 7. Again, it asks, based on the photographs in the political cartoon, what are 2 problems faced by many Americans in the early 1930s? So looking at document 7A, I'll just review what it says. At the title, it says Advertising for a Job in Detroit in the 1930s. And it reads, work is what I want and not charity. Who will help me? Get a job. 7 years in Detroit, no money, sent away. Furnish best of references, phone number, and then there's a number provided. Underneath for 7B, it's entitled The Soup Kitchen of 1931, and in the back it says free cup of coffee, donuts for the unemployed. So again, these are 2 documents you can use to help you answer question 7. And finally, there is 7C, which is your political cartoon. It's titled A Wise Economist Asks a Question. So you have a squirrel, and he says, but why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good? And then the gentleman on the bench says, I did. And next to him, it's entitled A Victim of the Bank Failure. So again, from those 3 documents, question 7 asks, based on the photographs in the political cartoon, what were 2 problems faced by many Americans in the early 1930s? All right, moving on. We're almost done. We have documents 8 and 9. Then we'll review again your historical tasks, give you a few ideas of what you want to start writing with, and then you have the time at home to start working on your essay. So document number 8. So question 8 for document 8 reads the following. According to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, what is one action the government should take to deal with the national economic emergency? So document 8 is a longer document, so stay with me, follow along, make sure you're highlighting important phrases, terms, and information that would help you answer question 8. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of war, but at the same time through this employment accomplishing greatly needed projects to stimulate and reorganize the use of our natural resources. Finally, in our progress toward the resumption of work, we require 2 safeguards against a return of the evils of the old order. There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credits and investments, so that there will be an end to speculation with other people's money, and there must be a provision for an adequate but sound currency. I am prepared under the constitutional duty that recommended the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. The measures or such other measures as Congress may build out of its existence and wisdom, I shall seek, within my constitutional authority, to bring a speedy adoption. But in the event that Congress shall fail to take one of these 2 courses, and in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask Congress for one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage war against the emergency. As great is the power that would be given to me if we were in fact involved in with a foreign foe. We do not distrust the future of essential democracy. The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. They have made me the present instrument of their wishes. In that spirit of the gift, I take it. So again, question 8 asks, according to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, what is one action the government should take to deal with the national economic crisis? All right, so we're coming to an end. We have document 9A and 9B. So let's look at the question for document 9A. It reads, according to Campbell Phillips, how was the nation affected by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's first 100 days? So question 9A reads, the tide turned with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's swift and decisive action as he took office. Despair turned into hope, and faith and confidence reached a peak as 100 days came to an end. The depression wasn't over, but the fear of it was. The knot in the belly that came from the dread of what another day might bring was gone. Things were looking up all over. If you had a job, you now felt reasonably certain of holding on to it. If you didn't have a job, the prospects of getting one were looking better. There were still apple sellers on the streets, and Chicago school teachers still rioted to get their payback, and the unemployed council still marched at city halls. But stories in the papers also showed a brighter side. The new CCC camps were being opened up. The Civil Works Administration was hiring men to repair streets and tidy up the parks. And the farmers in Iowa and Wisconsin were bringing their milk to market instead of dumping it in the highways. It was possible to have a good steak for dinner now and then, and you didn't feel extravagant if you spent a quarter to see a movie. Some families even ventured to plan summer vacations. The New York Times for Sunday, July 1st, carried 3 full-page stories of cruise advertisements. So again, from Document 9A, the question asks, according to Campbell Phillips, how was the nation affected by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's first 100 days? All right, finally, Document 9B. The question that goes with Document 9B that has to be answered says, according to Adam Cohen, state one way the New Deal ideas continue to influence actions that taken by the government. Document 9B reads, despite these challenges, to undo the New Deal, the fundamental elements of the New Deal provide resilient, long-lasting. President George W. Bush began his second term with an energetic campaign to privatize Social Security. He had to back down, however, in the face of strong bipartisan opposition. He went on to sign the Medicare prescription drug law, sponsored by Congressional Republicans, which significantly expanded the scope of the welfare state. The political discussion quickly moved onto health insurance, with a majority of Americans telling poll takers that they supported universal access to health care. Even with the ebbing and flowing of the federal regulatory regime, which varied depending on the administration in power, the idea that government had a duty to protect the public from dishonest stock offerings, unsafe food and drugs, and failed banks, which was revolutionary in 1933, had ceased to be controversial today. In the fall of 2008, when a Republican president and a Democratic Congress united to enact a $700 billion bailout of the financial industry, it was clear that the whole country had accepted the fundamental principles of the New Deal. So again, question 9B, your last question asks, according to Adam Cohen, state one way the New Deal ideas continue to influence actions taken by the government. So now that we've completed reading through the documents and reading through the questions, take a second, pause the video, go back, please make sure you have identified the correct information and highlighted within the text. Make sure that you've highlighted any questions or concerns in regard to vocabulary that we can go over back in class. Okay, once you've restarted the video, once again, the purpose of using our documents is to help you write your essay. So I'm just going to read your historical context one more time with your task in order to help you prepare to write your final essay. So again, your historical context says, throughout United States history, during times of crisis and change, the presidents have communicated their ideas to the American people to influence public opinion and to gain their support. These written addresses and speeches have had a significant impact on United States and American history. 3 such addresses include George Washington's farewell address of 1796, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address of 1863, and Franklin D. Roosevelt's first inaugural address of 1933. So your task is, using information from the documents and your knowledge of United States history, write an essay which you will select 2 of the 3 addresses mentioned in the historical context, and for each. So again, you're choosing 2 of the addresses, and for each you're doing 3 things. First, you'll describe the historical circumstance surrounding the address, so what was going on in history when that address was given. Secondly, you'll explain the major idea of the address. So what was the purpose of this address? What was the thesis? What is the point that the author is trying to convey? And finally, you'll discuss the impact of the address on the United States and American history and society. So how did this address ultimately impact American citizens, and is it still having an impact on us today? So guidelines, just some things to remember as you're going through your essay, is develop all 3 parts of the task for both of your addresses. Incorporate at least 4 of the documents. So we went through over 9 documents. You need to include at least 4 of them. Please make sure that you cite them and you also identify the correct text as well as where it came from. You have the proper citations. You'll incorporate relevant outside information. Very important to include other information. So whether it's about George Washington, his time as presidency, Abraham Lincoln, the lead up to the American Civil War, the Civil War itself, and finally FDR with the New Deal and also the Great Depression. So you have a lot of information you can pull from your study of American history. You'll support the theme with relevant facts, examples, and details. So be as detailed as possible. Remember to answer the why question. Why is this important? And finally, using logical, clear, and planned organization, include an introduction and conclusion that's beyond a simple restatement of the task. So the final thing before we end our video is you should have your graphic organizer with you. Use this as a guide in order to help you. Your essay at a minimum should be 4 paragraphs. You'll have your introduction, you'll have a body paragraph of address number 1 you choose, and body paragraph address number 2, and finally your conclusion explaining, wrapping everything together and talking about the importance and the relevance of this history today that we're studying. So again, please, if you have any questions, concerns, write them down in your packet, bring them into class, but the goal is to make sure your documents are done so you can start working on your essay at home. All right, thanks a lot.